This is Right to Life Radio. And now, here's your host, John Gerardi.
Good to be back in the saddle. We're talking about Tim Walz. We're going to talk about a detailed summary of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz's records when it comes to the abortion issue. John Gerardi here with Right to Life of Central California. Right to Life Radio, a production, as always, of Right to Life of Central California, rtlcc.org. We got a lot of stuff coming up for the start of the year. We've got upcoming in September, on September 5th, to Larry King's Right to Life is having their sort of big annual event with Jim Caviezel, Jesus, coming to speak. So go to tkrl.org to learn more about that. We've got a little next week, a little event at Holy Spirit Catholic Church that I'll be speaking at, and then we got schools are all starting up, pro-life presentations all over the place. Go to rtlcc.org if you want to learn more. We're trying to get volunteers for our Fresno Fair booth. We got 40 Days for Life, or sort of our smaller 40 Days for Life that we do in the fall coming up. So a lot of stuff going on. With me to talk about what's going on nationally is our good buddy, Mr. Jonathan Keller. What's up, Jonathan?
Yo, it's great to be here.
Jonathan,
it feels like it's been a while, even though I've been here the last 2 weeks. It's
yeah, well, we just haven't seen each other for a bit. We always need to check in. All right, so Jonathan Keller, CEO of California Family Council. So we are going to be talking about two really good articles that cover two really important topics. We didn't really get to talking about Tim Walz, Kamala Harris's new pick for to be her running mate, as she is now the nominee for the presidency. Joe Biden out, Kamala Harris in. We just snap our fingers, and I guess that's just what happens. So Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, is now her running mate. And when I heard this, I myself have Minnesota ties, a lot of Minnesota ties. Jonathan, you have some good friends in Minnesota from your counterparts at the Minnesota Family Council
and Family Institute.
Right.
Good people.
Yeah. So
shout out to, if they're listening to this, because we'll share it, Renee Carlson and Becca Delahunt.
Yeah. We possibly some people who may be coming on this show to talk about it. But anyway, I have connections in Minnesota. My wife grew up in Minnesota. My wife's parents and family all live in Minnesota. And I was surprised by the pick. I didn't think Tim Walz was all that popular, even in Minnesota. I think there's kind of a default Democrat, or a default reflex to vote for Democrats in Minnesota that is very strong and very deeply ingrained. Even in 1984, when Ronald Reagan won 49 out of 50 states in the biggest blowout win in practically in all of American history, the one state he did not win was Minnesota.
Correct.
Which I guess Walter Mondale was from there. Maybe that carried it through for him.
The last time that a Republican won Minnesota was 1972 when
Richard Nixon
won similarly a huge landslide. But yeah, that was literally it. It's those two states.
Pretty hard left.
Massachusetts and Minnesota are those two states that respectively in 84 and in 72 they resisted the trend. But
yeah,
it is, John, it's always interesting to me also, just a side note, like they are so oddly liberal there that they don't even just have the Democratic Party there. It is like
the Democrat Farm Labor, the DFL.
It's this weird like combo amalgamation, because they've been liberal and pro-labor hardcore union for such a long time. Like they're like, nope, we're not even giving up our own party.
Yeah, it's not even actually the Democrat Party. It's the Democrat Farm Labor Party. So it was kind of an amalgamation between the Democrat Party and I guess some kind of I've heard it described as a near socialist party. I'm not sure if that's just right-wing bluster or if that was actually true. But anyway, so very, very left-wing. And Walz was able to get a very narrow majority of Democrats in both houses of the Minnesota state legislature. Now, Minnesota's legislature was actually fairly in the middle. They have two houses to their state legislature, just like we do in California. And Republicans had been able to control one of the two houses for a pretty darn long time. For most of the last 20-plus years, Republicans held at least one of the two houses. And even though Minnesota frequently would elect Republican governors, it kept the state fairly moderate, I would say. Well, Walz got a very narrow majority of Democrats, and over the last 4 years has been able to enact some incredibly hardcore left-wing policies on a lot of different issues, and most notably on the issue of abortion. So I want to read a bit from this piece written by Charlie Camosi, who is a professor of medical humanities at Creighton University School of Medicine and a moral theology fellow at St. Joseph's Seminary in New York. I think he used to be at Fordham, as an ethicist. And so he goes, from one lousy Jesuit school to another. And so Charlie has...
he's a pretty decent guy, though.
He's a wonderful guy. Yes. Yeah, I save my... this is more inter-Catholic American University needling than anything else.
Kind of
as a graduate of a non-Jesuit American Catholic University.
So it's kind of like he is... I'm doing my syllogisms here. Charlie Camosi is to Fordham as Peter Kreeft is to Boston College.
More or less. Well, he was to Fordham as Peter Kreeft was, but now he's not even at Fordham anymore. Now he's at Creighton University Medical School, alma mater of our beloved board member here at Right to Life, Dr. Sil Bryan.
There you go.
There you go. All right. Now, vice presidential nominee. I think he went to Creighton. Is that him, or maybe it was his friend's kids or his son or something? Anyway, we have some Right to Life connection with Creighton University Medical School. I think it was Dr. Bryan Wynn. Anyway, all right. VP nominee Tim Walz supports the right to infanticide. This is written by Charlie Camosi in First Things. Now, let me just note before I start this. Charlie Camosi is not a fire-breathing right-winger.
I think
First Things magazine, which published this piece, is not a right-wing, fire-breathing publication.
Right.
Charlie himself is a scholar. He is a university professor. He is not a Republican.
That's what I was going to say.
By any stretch.
I actually thought
he is a self-avowed non-conservative. He does not characterize himself as a conservative. Okay.
Yeah.
He is very, very pro-life, though. Very, 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 very pro-life. Very dedicated to Catholic teaching when it comes to ethics issues and things like that. But not a right-winger. Not some kind of Republican activist. So when he's saying Tim Walz supports the right to infanticide,
that's a hefty claim.
That's a hefty claim that made me raise my eyebrows. And let's read it. Here's what he writes. Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris has picked Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota as her running mate. Walz recently legalized infanticide in the state of Minnesota. As someone who does not identify as conservative, I'd be delighted if this claim could be dismissed as a right-wing fever dream. Unfortunately, it is all too real. And by infanticide, I really do mean aiming at the death of newborn infants. So he then begins to talk about a historical thing. He talks about sort of the history of Christian ethics and the sort of transformation that Christianity made when it sort of really came onto the Roman scene after the Edict of Milan and the Emperor Constantine converting. That in ancient Greece and Rome, the widespread practice of abandoning unwanted infants. That this was a very commonplace thing in the Roman Empire. The abandonment or killing of infants who were born with some kind of deformity or disability, or someone who was just not wanted, or a girl, or maybe you had a child with a slave or something. This was a systematically widespread thing. So he goes on to talk about this, but he then brings the conversation back to Tim Walz. In 2023, Walz supported an omnibus health bill that radically changed his state's abortion law. This health bill, in a callback to the ancient practice of abandoning newborns, intentionally and explicitly legalized the denial of life-saving medical care to infants born alive after botched abortions. State law used to explicitly protect these babies, but Walz and his supporters changed it, insisting that references to abortion be removed and that medical care be changed to mere care. So maybe comfort care or something, as opposed to actual medical care to help this child. Okay.
Yeesh.
In addition, while the original law required medical personnel to, quote, preserve the life and health of the born alive infant, the Walz-supported change struck that whole line. It now requires medical personnel merely to, quote, care for the infant who is born alive. No more requirements to preserve the life and health of the born alive infant after a botched abortion. Got it. Now, he then talks about how New York State did something very similar, how Governor Ralph Northam of Virginia made the comment about this precise thing we've talked about. And Donald Trump mentions this all the time, anytime the abortion discussion comes up. Camosi writes, this kind of intentional non-treatment of newborns so they die is now routine in our culture. Governor Northam admitted it. The state of Minnesota also admitted it via their state records. So that was one of the other aspects, is that there are about 8 children in Minnesota in the last year, I believe, for whom this precise outcome happened, that they were born alive after a botched abortion and they did not receive any care, and then they died. So this is not just like a theoretical thing that never happens. It is a thing that happens.
Yep.
I actually had kind of I think it was actually a fairly constructive discussion about this with Mike Carbasi, of all people, our city council member, who was sort of incredulous because it was after I appeared on the GV Wire program. It was shortly after the Biden-Trump presidential debate. And Mike was saying Trump is completely ridiculous talking about people, killing children after they're born alive. That's already illegal everywhere. And I had to explain to him that, well, no, what Trump's referring to is refusing to provide care to a child who's been born alive. And he was actually fairly open to hearing about it, and I explained the issue to him. So we actually, it was off mic, but we actually had a fairly... It was something that I think he had no idea of. And I think 99% of people, this is why I like Mike, even though he's pro-choice, is that I think he's actually willing to listen to a rational argument if you are being rational and nice.
You can have a respectful discussion.
Exactly. And I just think 99% of people don't know about this. Now, Camosi goes on to talk about it. The state of Minnesota admitted it in their state records. Camosi also wrote a detailed article for the publication called Public Discourse that demonstrate just how often this happens, especially but not only when the baby has an unwanted disability. For instance, Camosi's writing has shown how, in one case, a family was given a life-limiting diagnosis, spina bifida, which people can live with spina bifida. Like it's a disability, it's a hindrance, but it's not a death sentence by any sense. A family was given a diagnosis of spina bifida for their child prenatally, and then, after fending off repeated and aggressive suggestions that they ought to have an abortion, being told that they could wait until her son was born and withhold treatment then. So here you have a kid being born with spina bifida, and instead of helping the kid, you just let the kid die. Withholding life-sustaining treatment because the baby is too disabled and we want them to die now is fairly common in today's neonatal intensive care units. Yale bioethicist and neonatologist Mark Mercurio writes in the Journal of Perinatology that most neonatologists and other physicians have some cases in which they will withhold life-sustaining medical care because the patient is too disabled, and other cases in which they will not. So basically, it seems like what these docs will do is they'll withhold care if it's a baby, a newborn that's born with some kind of disability, but they won't if it's like a 5-year-old. And the way that Camosi describes it is that some of these clinicians think of it as like, well, if you provide care for this baby, you're creating a disabled person. But not if it's a 5-year-old. That's a disabled person who's already there, as if the newborn is not alive.
Well, it's in line with essentially what we've said, and I don't know if we've brought it up on this show before, but I think John, you and I at least at minimum have talked about it in the past. Another very esteemed, quote unquote, medical ethicist of the last several decades, alongside Dr. Camosi, is Peter Singer.
Right.
And the entire idea that basically says, well, if you are a child and you are within potentially a 30-day window or something. I mean, he's floated all sorts of different ideas.
Yeah, well, I think he's set up to a year. That
essentially you have a no questions asked return policy.
Yeah, and he's sort of basing it on ableism. Now, when we return, I want to talk about sort of the medical ethical implications of a lot of this. So, I mean, this is by the way, the policy Walz supported, not just supported, but actually legally enacted in Minnesota. What this means for medical ethics, and we will dig into that next on Right to Life Radio. Back with Right to Life Radio, we are discussing Governor Tim Walz and his record. When it comes to the abortion issue. In addition to supporting legal abortion, Walz even signed legislation in Minnesota that takes away requirements to care for children who have survived a botched abortion attempt. And we're reading the piece by Charlie Camosi talking about what he believes is a very widespread practice in American NICU units of simply not providing care to newborns when they are not wanted in various circumstances, such as in situations where the child's born with a serious disability. Now, I want to get this to sort of this medical ethical question, which is there are a lot of different standards by which pro-choice authors are talking about, when does a human child have value? Now, Jonathan, you mentioned in the last segment Peter Singer. Mm-hmm. Now, Peter Singer is an ethicist at Princeton University, and you talked about his one-year return policy, basically, which the way Singer describes it is Singer looks at human life as having value based on when an entity can have a sense of self, a kind of self-conception. And in his view, human beings don't really have that until they're at least about a year along. He thinks actually some animals have that.
Right.
Which is bizarre that Peter Singer is like so blasé about human life, but he's also a very strict vegetarian, or like a lot of like vegan, vegetarian, like ethically vegan, vegetarian people sort of cite him. Like he thinks like a fully mature pig or dog has more of a sense of self, a self concept than a newborn does. Certainly
a dolphin or some higher primates or an octopus, even in some cases, they've been shown. Oh well, these animals
to be delicious. Sorry,
they clearly have a much greater sense of problem-solving ability. They have potentially. When you observe
like that one octopus who predicted all the correct teams to win the World Cup a couple of years. Right. That was about a decade ago.
But then other things like social behavior and things like that. And you look at that, and if you do not believe that there is anything inherently unique and different about humans, if you don't believe. I'm going to use my favorite evangelical buzzword that always gets you. If you don't believe in the Imago Dei.
Oh, gosh. Okay, it's a sidebar. For those who are wondering about this is a running joke Jonathan and I have. There's a lot of Baptists have tried to talk about Presbyterians have tried to talk about concepts of human dignity by using the phrase Imago Dei.
That's right.
Which is a Latin phrase that means the image of God. And even though I am a Latin major and a Catholic, I've been very confused why they've been using the phrase Imago Dei when the English term image of God does the exact same amount of work in the exact same way. It's almost like they're using it as like a, I don't know, it's like it's a brand name or something.
Everybody knows, John, if you're doing a movie or a radio show or a television show, and you want to convey gravity and seriousness in your in your
you
scene,
just throw in a Latin phrase,
in some Latin words, and that makes it all the difference.
Yeah, and I no one is more guilty of that than John Gerardi. But I'm constantly just befuddled at oh yes, well if you think about the concept of human beings as the Imago Dei,
that's right,
and I'm like. Just say image of God. It's the exact same. It's literally the same thing. Anyway.
Is it though?
Now,
Yes.
so you have a lot of ethicists like Peter Singer who are talking about, well, humans only have value when they can engage in sort of self-reflection. The legal regime, though, that Tim Walz enacted in Minnesota when he was governor, basically saying that life-giving care only needs to be given to infants. Life-giving care does not need to be given to infants who survive abortion, where we're focused not on human life as intrinsically valuable that deserves care. We're not focused on the treatment itself and whether it will be effective or not. We're focusing on whether someone else wants this child. And these decisions that are being made by neonatologists around the country about whether to give or not give care, not on the basis of whether the care will be helpful, not on the basis of whether the care will save the child's life, not on the basis of whether the care is unduly burdensome or anything like that, whether you're prolonging life versus prolonging death, and there's all kinds of ethical things to think about with providing care, but not focusing on that, not taking the value of this human life as a given, basing it on, well, this child has a disability. Do we want to prolong this child? Do we want this child to live with a disability?
Right.
And I've talked with people who are, parents of children with disabilities who just find this monstrous. And that is the Democrat ticket. I think the prevailing liberal, modern American left view on abortion rights is not even to have some kind of ethical discussion about, when people can have self-reference. No, it's purely a question of will. It's a question of pitting the will of the mother against the will of the baby, and tie goes to the mother. This zero-sum game where mother and child are absolute strangers to each other with no obligations or ties whatsoever.
Well, and John, one of my favorite, just have a side note, one of my favorite podcasts that I listen to is the Commentary Magazine podcast. And one of the lines that they have on there all the time, they have one guy who's kind of the Debbie Downer, and his classic line is he always says, "It's worse than that."
It's worse than that.
And they actually have merch T-shirts that say it's worse than that. So I will say, to your point, talking about Tim Walz and how bad it is, it's worse than that.
Yeah.
Because not only did Tim Walz sign this bill that changes the rules regarding care, medical care, it's worse than that, because you might wonder, well, now that we've changed these rules, how many children are dying? Surely the numbers are probably going to go up if they do not have to provide any sort of actual care. It's just comfort care, basically.
Yeah.
Well, you'd love to know those numbers, but in conjunction with that, they also passed a bill that repeals the reporting requirements.
Taking a page from the old California book about not reporting your abortion numbers.
And this is actually something, in talking to our friends from Minnesota, they actually had originally said Minnesota for a while, because they had for a while this great pro-life Republican governor, Tim Pawlenty.
Yeah.
And they had a narrow Republican majority. They actually had really good abortion reporting laws.
Yeah.
All of those have been wiped away.
Yeah. All right. Now, when we return, we'll talk more broadly about, we want to give a big summary of the Kamala Harris record on abortion. And we're going to read a great article by Ryan Anderson about that. That is next on Right to Life Radio. Back with Right to Life Radio, we're now going to shift gears, going from Tim Walz back to Kamala Harris. Jonathan Keller from California Family Council here. Now, Jonathan, we have been following with interest, oftentimes with revulsion, the rise to power of Kamala Harris. She was our Attorney General here in California for several years. She got elected to be our U.S. Senator representing us in California. She became Vice President, and now she is the one running for president. And I thought that this piece, published again in First Things by Ryan Anderson, which I learned after the fact you helped him with a little bit.
Just a little.
Then Ryan asked you for clarification on some of the California-specific stuff. This piece from August 7th, written by Ryan Anderson, was, I think, really a magisterial, thorough summary of all of Kamala Harris's positions on abortion and how extreme she is. So I want to kind of go through it. That she is not just kind of pro-abortion. Like, I feel like every election we say this is the most pro-abortion person to ever run for president. And I think it's true, because I think the Democratic Party norm just keeps shifting further and further left. And
right.
I do, though. So I feel like when people hear this is the most radically pro-abortion presidential candidate ever, I think sometimes people have a tendency to tune us out and think, okay, it's just these pro-lifers. Yeah, the most pro-abortion president ever. Blah, 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 blah. And it's like, well, no, there are concrete policy things where she is worse than anyone before her. Or at the very least, she's just as bad as Biden, who was, a click worse than Hillary / Barack Obama. So, Kamala's abortion extremism. Kamala Harris, Ryan Anderson writes, is an abortion extremist. Her words and actions over the course of her career as California's Attorney General, as U.S. Senator, and as Vice President leave no doubt as to that fact. From targeting pro-life journalists and forcing pregnancy centers to advertise for abortion in her AG days, to voting to override state pro-life laws in her Senate days, she has repeatedly made clear her fealty to the abortion lobby. Since becoming the presumptive Democratic nominee for the presidency, Harris has sown confusion about her political vision by reversing many of her own publicly stated positions, but one thing remains constant. Abortion is her top priority. He then talks about Harris celebrating abortion, how they keep talking about this, like the New York Times trumpets how she's this historic first. She's the first president or vice president to ever visit an abortion clinic.
God help us. Every time I'm reminded of that.
Yeah, visited Minnesota, the first state to enact pro-abortion legislation after the Dobbs decision, signed into law by Tim Walz, whom she has now picked as her running mate. Harris's visit to Planned Parenthood took place during her national Fight for Reproductive Freedoms tour. This tour, meant to make abortion the centerpiece of what was then the Biden-Harris campaign, followed her fall 2023 Fight for Our Freedoms college tour. That tour, as the White House explained, was meant to motivate students to, quote, fight for reproductive freedom, end quote, among other progressive desiderata. The abortion tours are not merely symbolic. They express Harris's extremism. During her presidential campaign in 2019, Harris explained to an MSNBC town hall audience the process by which she would preempt state pro-life laws. Under a Harris administration, any state pro-life law, quote, would have to come before my Department of Justice for a review and approval before it could take effect. You imagine how many such laws would have received, quote, approval. Now, that was a wild policy suggestion she was making in 2019, which I think I noticed at the time. I don't know if we talked about it back then, Jonathan, but the idea of states passing a law that the federal DOJ would then have to review and approve before they could come into effect. In addition to being kind of to being aggressively pro-abortion, would also be a wild attack on federalism. Just the idea of a state government passing a law to regulate stuff in that state and then needing a federal review process from the executive branch before they could do something. It's wild. The Biden-Harris administration has promoted abortion and interfered with state pro-life laws, as Harris promised. The means were various. The Biden-Harris administration turned Title X into an abortion counseling mandate, turned taxpayer dollars into abortion funds, turned emergency rooms and VA hospitals into abortion clinics, turned the U.S. Postal Service into an abortion pill delivery service, and turned protections for pregnant workers into an abortion mandate. As a senator, she didn't just hypothetically support protecting abortion. She voted for all kinds of abortion stuff. She voted against the Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act, which we just talked about in the last segment, the idea of providing care to preserve the health and life of children who survive an abortion attempt. She voted against it. She voted against the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, which would have required medical professionals to provide care to children who survive abortion procedures. Lacking this protection, such children can be abandoned, neglected, allowed to die. Actually, the Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act was a ban on abortion at the 20-week point of pregnancy. This is back when Republicans wanted to pass federal legislation to limit abortion, back when they knew it could never come into effect and they would face no political repercussions. That was when they wanted to vote for those things. Anyway. Cowards. All right. Worthless cowards. All right. She was the original Senate co-sponsor of the Women's Health Protection Act of 2019, which would have imposed abortion on demand nationwide at any stage of pregnancy.
This is a pretty extensive list, John.
It is. That's why I liked this. That's why I liked this article. It's a very comprehensive presentation. When Harris presided over the 2022 Senate vote on this bill, she publicly lamented the bill's failure to pass. So, as vice president, she supported this same bill. Basically, this was a bill to, instead of making abortion legal nationwide through a Supreme Court interpretation of the Constitution, just pass a normal law. A normal federal law saying we're overriding any state law about abortion. Abortion has to be legal throughout the United States for all 40 weeks of pregnancy for any reason. The next year, in an interview with ABC News, she called on Congress to respond to the Dobbs decision by passing pro-abortion legislation, promising that Biden would sign it. Harris also wants to force all American taxpayers to pay for abortion. She called for the repeal of the Hyde Amendment when she was in the Senate, the bipartisan rider that has been attached to HHS appropriations since 1976 to prevent taxpayer dollars from funding abortions through Medicaid. Michael New, the social scientist from Catholic University of America, has estimated that about 2.5 million unborn babies have been saved from abortion by the means of the Hyde Amendment. Harris also voted against the No Taxpayer Funding for Abortion Act, which would have extended Hyde's protections to the entirety of the federal government. Harris wants to force pro-lifers to violate their consciences. In the Senate, she supported legislation that threatened religious liberty, particularly in the context of abortion, was the lead sponsor of the perversely named Do No Harm Act, a bill that would narrow the Religious Freedom Restoration Act so as to withhold religious liberty protections against abortion mandates. She was an original co-sponsor of the, quote, Equality Act, which would have imposed radical gender ideology on the nation and contained provisions that could have forced taxpayers to fund elective abortions and forced doctors and hospitals to perform abortions, even if it's against their conscience or beliefs. In addition to that, she's also kind of anti-Catholic. She voted against and raised the issue for several federal judges that Donald Trump nominated, raised the issue that they were members of the Knights of Columbus, which I am, full disclosure, I am a Knight of Columbus myself. It's like a Catholic service/fraternal organization. They offer health insurance to members. Basically, it's groups of guys at Catholic parishes who volunteer to help out the church in various capacities.
It's a social club.
They like
in
grilling,
a positive way.
Yeah, they like
grilling
service
projects, and
they like grilling meats. that's a big thing about being a Knight of Columbus. So she was saying, "Hey, can you be? I don't know if you could be a federal judge. You're a Knight of Columbus," which is exactly the same as saying, "I don't know that you could be a federal judge. You're a Catholic." Like, basically imposing a religious test. As Attorney General of California, Harris filed her own amicus brief with the Supreme Court against Hobby Lobby. Hobby Lobby at that time was trying to fight against federal mandates to provide abortifacient drugs and devices under their employer-based health insurance plans for employees. Now we get back to her days in California. Now, as the Attorney General of California, she was a co-sponsor of the Reproductive Fact Act.
AB 775.
AB 775, which Jonathan was director of CFC at that time. This was the bill that would have that required pro-life pregnancy centers like Pregnancy Care Center in Fresno, others, required them to put a notice on the wall of their waiting room or at a page in their new patient packet, letting people know where they could go to get abortions. So forcing pro-life pregnancy centers to advertise to their clients, hey, this is where you can go to get an abortion. The Supreme Court of the United States overturned that law in 2017, a decision called Nifla v. Becerra, and said that it violated the First Amendment rights of the pro-life clinics. Harris sponsored it. Harris was an enthusiastic adopter and backer of this bill. Tried to enforce it, was the chief California law enforcement official charged with enforcing it. She's also directly targeted pro-life activists like David Daleiden. David Daleiden, who released all kinds of video footage showing Planned Parenthood officials and other abortion people who work for abortion clinics or for other companies, evidence that they were engaged in or wanted to engage in the sale of the body parts of aborted children for profit. Basically, researchers wanted fetal tissue for research, and abortion providers were engaged in, including our Fresno Planned Parenthood Marmonte, which runs the Fresno Planned Parenthood. They were selling fetal tissue samples from aborted children to a middleman company called STEM Express, which was then turning around and selling those body parts to researchers. Now, California law says you cannot make a profit doing that. Planned Parenthood tried to argue, well, no, we weren't making a profit. We were just offsetting our costs.
Surprise, surprise.
Anyway, the video evidence David Daleiden uncovered made it very much seem like people were actively profiting, making money off of this, including Planned Parenthood officials bragging about, hey, I'd like to drive a Ferrari, which I don't think you get to drive a Ferrari by doing sales that offset your costs.
And I can tell you, John, because I have been to David Daleiden's house. I think he's moved since then, but he has released, if you go online, you check Twitter or Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, you can find video that he recorded of the 9 DOJ employees. I think it was either 9 or 11. It was at least 9. That
with guns.
Kamala Harris sent them into David Daleiden's home and raided his house, took hundreds of hours of unaired footage. Mm-hmm. And this was just a few weeks after she had had a private meeting with top staffers from Planned Parenthood.
Yeah, so here she is taking orders from Planned Parenthood to investigate, go after this guy, this journalist who exposed some really bad stuff that was happening with Planned Parenthood that led to congressional investigation, congressional referrals for criminal investigation to the FBI. But no, she's going after the whistleblowers. That's Kamala Harris. That is her record. We'll be back with more on this as we close out this week's episode of Right to Life Radio. That is next on Power Talk. Back with Right to Life Radio, we just did a kind of exhaustive summary, Jonathan, in the last segment of Kamala Harris's record on abortion.
Kudos to our friend Ryan Anderson.
Yes. Her record on abortion is terrible. It is so aggressively bad as to beg your belief. Now, Jonathan, you had seen that there's a group called Evangelicals for Harris
yes.
that was forming, and you had some thoughts on that in the last minute and a half we have here.
I do. Just so briefly, look, taking off, as we always say, for IRS purposes, taking off my 501c3 hat. I'm putting on my Jonathan Keller private citizen hat.
All right, this is Jonathan just saying his view.
Just telling you. If you look at the difference between the two different parties, if you look at the fact that we had John, one of our good buddies, David French at the New York Times, wrote an article.
You're a good buddy, not my buddy.
Essentially saying, I mean, literally the title of it, to save conservatism from itself, I'm voting for Kamala Harris. And I think I would just look at it, if you were someone who values life and family and marriage and religious liberty, but specifically for purposes of this show, if you care about life, there is a massive difference between these two tickets. Even with all the problems the Republicans have, even with all the frustrations and agita that you and I have expressed, John, about the lack of pro-life plank on the platform, there is still no comparison between the extremism of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz as opposed to Donald Trump and J.D. Vance.
The records on this issue are pretty stark. And Harris is, it's interesting how if there's absolutely no fig leaf that, in spite of the Republicans sliding on the issue a bit, and we've bewailed that, we've talked about how that's bad, there's no movement on this issue from the Harris camp. That'll do it for Right to Life Radio. See you next time on Power Talk.